Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a huge economic question by looking at what was, honestly, one of the most powerful and tragic experiments in all of modern history.
So, imagine this for a second. What if you could take a whole country, same people, same culture, same history, and just split it right down the middle, like a giant A/B test? One side gets a market economy, the other gets a centrally planned one. And then you just hit start and see what happens over the next 50 years. What do you think would happen?
Well, here's the crazy thing. This wasn't just some thought experiment. It actually happened. After World War II, history itself set up this incredible, almost perfect test case. The division of Germany and later Korea created these real-world laboratories for comparing two completely different ways of running an economy.
So you've got West Germany and South Korea going the market economy route. And on the flip side, you have East Germany and North Korea going with centrally planned command economies. And the key thing here, the reason this is so fascinating, is that they started from almost the exact same place. Same people, same culture. It's an unbelievably clean comparison.
Okay, so what happened? What did the results of this massive experiment show? Well, let me tell you, it wasn't even close. The paths these countries took weren't just a little different, they were wildly different. The economic gap that opened up was just staggering.
And, you can read all the academic papers you want, but sometimes the internet just says it best. I love this quote from a Reddit user. It's blunt for sure, but it really nails the consensus view of what happened from a purely economic standpoint. The market economies just pulled away, big time. And this wasn't just a one-off thing happening in Germany and Korea. No way. You see the same pattern play out all over the place during the Cold War. Look at this data here. You have market economies like Taiwan and Austria just consistently outpacing their planned economy counterparts like China and Czechoslovakia. It's a clear trend.
And we're not just talking about slightly slower growth. This was a real, measurable economic hit. A big study from Lund University actually put a number on it. They found that when developing countries went with a socialist planned economy, their annual growth rates dropped by about 2% on average. Now, 2% might not sound like a lot, but trust me, you compound that year after year, decade after decade, and the difference is absolutely massive.
Okay, so the big question is, why? Why this huge gap? What was really going on under the hood? To get it, we have to look at the operating system of each economy, right? How did they actually decide what to make and how much of it to make?
This table here breaks it down perfectly. On the capitalist side, you've got private property. The whole thing is coordinated by market prices, it's decentralized, information is flowing everywhere, horizontally between buyers and sellers. But on the socialist side, it's totally different. The state owns everything and it's all coordinated by a central plan. Information flows top-down like a command from a general.
Right, so think about prices in a market economy. They're basically like a massive, constantly updating information system. Let's say millions of people suddenly decide they love oat milk lattes. The price of oats goes up. What does that signal tell you? It tells farmers, hey, plant more oats. And it tells entrepreneurs, maybe open a new cafe. It's this incredible, organic, bottom-up way of figuring out what society wants.
Now, a planned economy just throws that whole system out the window. Instead, you have a committee of smart people, like the famous Gaz plan in the Soviet Union, sitting in a room trying to calculate everything. How many left shoes do we need in Minsk this year? How much steel should go to building tractors versus building bridges? They try to map out the entire economy in these massive, rigid 5-year plans.
And this, right here, this gets us to the absolute heart of the problem. It's the central reason why these planned economies ran into so much trouble. It's a famous idea in economics, first really laid out by Ludwig von Mises, called the economic calculation problem. And honestly, it's probably the single biggest intellectual challenge to the whole idea of central planning.
The core idea is surprisingly straightforward. Without real market prices, the central planners are basically flying blind. Think about it. How does a committee in the capital city decide whether it's more important to build a new tractor factory or a new fertilizer plant? Without prices that reflect what people actually want and how scarce resources are, there's just no good way to make that choice rationally. You're just guessing. So these planners were up against some huge challenges. First, like we said, no price signals. They couldn't tell you the real value of a factory or a machine. Second, there's what the economist Friedrich Hayek called the dispersed knowledge problem. Basically, all the important information isn't in some big government computer. It's spread out in the heads of millions of regular people. Third, the information they did get was often wrong.
A factory manager had every reason to lowball what they could produce to make their targets easier to hit. And last but not least, the whole system was just slow and clunky, totally unable to adapt.
And you can see the effect of all these problems right here, in this chart. This is a measure called Total Factor Productivity, or TFP. The easiest way to think about TFP is it's a measure of an economy's efficiency and innovation. How good is it at turning inputs, like labor and machines, into outputs? And look at this difference. West Germany's TFP growth just blows the USSR's out of the water. This tells you it wasn't just about having fewer resources. It's that the system itself was fundamentally less efficient at using what it had.
So, after looking at all this, what's the big lesson? What do we take away from this giant, decades-long natural experiment? Well, I think it's about something much deeper than just GDP charts. It's really about how a society organizes itself to use knowledge and encourage creativity.
Here's the bottom line, really. The price system in a market is like a massive, decentralized supercomputer. It's processing billions of bits of information every single second from everyone's choices, and it uses that information to steer resources to where they're needed most. A central planning committee, no matter how brilliant or well-intentioned, could never hope to match that sheer processing power. It's an information problem. And that information gap wasn't just some abstract theory. It had real, tangible consequences for people's lives. It's why you saw those infamous shortages, the long lines for bread or toilet paper. It's why there was so little variety or quality in the goods that were available. There was just no incentive for anyone to innovate or make things better. The whole system was just stuck.
And that brings us to one last, really interesting idea to chew on. Maybe the biggest advantage of a market economy isn't just that it makes a country richer. This quote points out that when the market and prices decide who gets what, you don't have to fight about it politically. It takes a huge number of decisions off the table for politicians. So the final question I'll leave you with is this. What's the real value of a system that can solve economic problems without turning every single one of them into a political battle?
Have you ever just stopped and looked around at our modern world and thought about how incredibly, ridiculously wealthy we are? I mean, seriously, things we just take for granted. Electricity, clean water on tap, all the information in the world in our pockets. Our ancestors from just a few hundred years ago would have thought it was straight up magic. Today, we're going to dig into maybe the biggest story in human history, how we went from thousands of years of going nowhere to a complete explosion of wealth.
It really all boils down to this one simple question. For almost all of human history, progress was, well, flat. And then, around 200 years ago, something happened. The whole game changed. So what was it? Let's get into it.
Okay, so check this out. These numbers kind of set the stage perfectly. Back in 1820, the richest 10% of people earned about half of everything. Fast forward 200 years, the whole world is unimaginably richer, but the share of that wealth for the bottom 50% has actually gone down. It's a story of amazing growth, for sure, but also one of really deep, stubborn inequality.
To really understand the explosion, we first have to understand the silence that came before. What did the world actually look like when economic growth just wasn't a thing? For hundreds of years in Europe, the system was feudalism. And if you had to describe it in one word, that word would be static, unchanging. Your place in the world was decided the day you were born. The economy was all about the local manor, this little self-contained world where you didn't earn wealth through some brilliant new idea, you inherited it, or you got it by being loyal to your lord. The whole game was rigged to keep things exactly as they were.
And this is what that looks like. I mean, just try to imagine living a life that was pretty much a carbon copy of your great-great-great-grandparents' life. You're using the same tools, eating the same food, you're going to live about as long as they did. That was reality. There was no engine pushing things forward, because the rules were all about preventing change, not encouraging it. But then, slowly at first, and then really fast, the rules started to change. A totally new economic engine was being built, one piece at a time.
You can kind of see the evolution right here. You go from that isolated feudal manor to mercantilism, where power starts to shift to towns and traders who are moving goods around. But the really seismic shift, the one that changes everything, starts in the 18th century with industrial capitalism. All of a sudden, the most important place in the world isn't the king's court anymore. It's the open market, and it's the factories.
So what was the software running on this new engine? Well, it was three big ideas. First, private property. The idea that you, an individual, could own something that makes stuff, not just the king. Second, market competition, letting prices be set by just, how much there is of something and how many people want it.
And third, capital accumulation. This really radical thought that you shouldn't just spend your profits, you should plow them back into the business to make even more wealth. Each one of those was a direct attack on that old, static feudal world.
Okay, so we've got the blueprint. Now, let's pop the hood and see how all these pieces fit together to create this unbelievable engine of growth.
You can think of competition as the system's gas pedal, and it's always pushed to the floor. In a market, you just can't stand still. Someone, somewhere, is always trying to make a better or cheaper version of what you're selling. And that constant pressure, that race, it forces everyone to get smarter, faster, and more efficient. And who's the ultimate winner? We are, the consumers, who get better stuff for less money.
And if competition is the gas pedal, then capital accumulation is the fuel. See, in this system, profit isn't the finish line. It's the fuel for the next lap. By taking the money you make and reinvesting it in better machines, bigger factories, more research, you create this incredible feedback loop where growth just keeps funding more growth. It's a virtuous cycle.
Now, the economist Joseph Schumpeter came up with this amazing name for how this all works: creative destruction. And it's perfect, because he saw that real progress isn't just about building new things. It's also about being willing to destroy the old, inefficient ways of doing things. It can be messy, it can even be painful for some, but it's absolutely essential for long-term growth.
And this is the perfect way to understand it. Think about the jump from candles to light bulbs. The invention of the light bulb was a complete and total disaster if you were a candle maker. Your whole industry was about to get wiped out. But for society, it was revolutionary. It gave birth to this massive new electrical industry. Power plants, wiring, electricians, the whole shebang, and it made life dramatically better for literally everyone. That is creative destruction in a nutshell.
So, you take private property, you add in fierce competition, you fuel it with capital accumulation, and you let creative destruction clear the way. What do you get when you put it all together? You get the payoff. You unlock what historians now call the Great Enrichment.
And the difference is just staggering. For centuries, remember, economic growth was basically zero. But with this new capitalist engine fired up, Western countries started hitting sustained growth of 2% or more, year after year. Now, 2% might not sound like a lot, but when you compound that over decades, it is the difference between standing still and launching into orbit.
And that brings us to what might be the single most important chart in all of economic history, the hockey stick of growth. For all of recorded time, human prosperity is the long, flat part of the handle. And then around 1820, we hit the blade, and the line just goes almost vertical. It's an explosion of wealth that the world had never, ever seen before.
But here's the thing. This enrichment didn't happen for everyone at the same time. The gap between the richest and poorest countries just exploded, hitting its peak right around 1980. But then, look at the last 40 years. As huge countries like China and India started to open up their markets, that massive gap has finally started to shrink, pulling hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty. And inside those countries that got rich first, something incredible happened. That period after World War II, what people call the golden age of capitalism, the economic pie grew so fast that pretty much everyone got a bigger slice. This is the moment in history when we see the creation of something totally new, a huge, prosperous middle class.
But of course, the story doesn't just stop there. The capitalist engine that created all this wealth is itself changing. And here in the 21st century, it's starting to face a whole new set of challenges.
Which brings us to the big question for our time. We know this engine is unbelievably powerful, but what are its side effects today? Is it still creating prosperity for everyone, or is it starting to concentrate wealth in new and maybe worrying ways?
The modern data is, well, it's pretty stark. In the US just a couple of years ago, the top 1% of households held more wealth than the entire bottom 50% combined. That level of concentration tells you that the way the system is handing out its rewards is changing in a really fundamental way.
So what's driving this? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle is that the nature of capital itself has transformed. Industrial capital was physical stuff, factories, machines, things that needed lots of people to run them. Today's capital is more and more digital. It's software, it's algorithms. And that kind of capital can be scaled up to serve millions of people around the globe with almost no extra labor and at practically zero cost.
This quote just nails the new reality we're in. When production shifts from physical factories filled with workers to cloud servers running algorithms, the ownership of those algorithms becomes everything. In this new world, value is shifting away from labor and toward intellectual property, concentrating wealth in the hands of the people who own the code.
And that leaves us with a really deep, kind of profound question to think about. The economic engine that pulled humanity out of poverty was always built on this partnership between capital and labor. But what happens when technology, like AI and automation, makes capital so productive on its own that it doesn't need that partnership as much?